Hello, everyone, and welcome to this transmission. It is a pleasure to welcome you to today's interactive lecture. My name is Dr. Angelica Maria Rojas, Associate Professor at Universidad del Cauca in Colombia, and I will have the pleasure of moderating today's session. Today's lecture is entitled Manufacturing Institutional Non-Decision, a Critical Discourse Analysis of US Gaza Discourse at the United Nations Security Council. Our speaker is Mr. Mounir Chader, a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Languages, Letters, and Arts, Ibn Tufayl University, Morocco. His research focuses on critical discourse analysis, with particular attention to the relationship between language, ideology, and institutional power. His current work examines how discourse contributes to legitimizing institutional inaction in the context of the Gaza conflict. We're also pleased to have Mr. Martu, who will join us as our reporter by summarizing the lecture and facilitating audience interaction during discussion at the end. Without further ado, I warmly invite Mr. Mounir Chader to begin his presentation. Mr. Chader?
Yes, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Before I begin, I want to extend my sincere thanks to Beit Alisaniyat, to the entire panel, and especially to Professor Ahmed Ben Isa for making this event a reality, for inviting me to speak today, and for providing such an academic space. I'm sharing with you today my work titled Manufacturing Institutional Non-Decision, a Critical Discourse Analysis of US Gaza Discourse at the United Nations Security Council. Now, behind that long title is a fairly simple question. So let me start with what the study is really about. This is a study about how language can be used not to start a war or to justify going to war, but to do nothing, to keep an institution from acting and to make that inaction look reasonable, even responsible to the people watching. Our case is the United Nations Security Council and its handling of Gaza between October 23 and September 25. Now, over those 23 months, the Council failed again and again to pass binding measures on what has become one of the gravest humanitarian catastrophes of our time. And over those same months, the United States cast 6 vetoes that blocked those measures. Now, everyone already knows that the United States vetoed those resolutions. That is not news, and it is not my contribution. What I want to show you today is something quieter and I think more interesting, how those vetoes were talked about, how they were explained, justified, and made to seem like prudence rather than obstruction. Because I argue that the language around the veto is not decoration, it is part of a machinery, it is part of the inaction or how the inaction was produced and sustained. So this is a talk about words, but words that have juridical and humanitarian consequences, because now before we dive in, here's the path we will take. I will begin with the problem and the central argument, then I will lay out the foundations, the objectives, the theory, and the method. The core of the talk is in 2 movements. First, the architecture of this discourse, its 3 mechanisms, then its trajectory, how it hardens over time, and I'll close with what the case shows and why it matters. So let me begin by setting out the problem. The problem here is the puzzle that motivates the whole study. The Security Council has a clear mandate under Article 24 of the United Nations Charter It carries primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, and it acts on behalf of all member states. And by the way, these are the Charter's own words. So it is designed to respond to exactly this kind of crisis. And yet, in the face of a documented catastrophe, it did not respond. Consider the scale of what we are talking about. Please look at the figures on the right. A population representative survey published in the Lancet Global Health estimates roughly 75,000 violent deaths between October 23 and January 25. Moreover, more than 90% of Gaza's population has been displaced, and a catastrophic man-made famine has spread throughout the Strip of Gaza. Now, against that backdrop, the United States cast 6 consecutive vetoes, and it did so increasingly alone. The Council's veto came to stand repeatedly at 14-1. Now, how does the existing scholarship explain this paralysis? The conventional account or the standard account treats the Council's paralysis as the function of the veto alone. So it is read as a procedural fact. It is read as a procedural fact, about the distribution of power. The council didn't act because one permanent member kept blocking it. End of story. And that account is accurate. I'm not here to deny it, but I argue it is incomplete. So here is the gap. The conventional account identifies the mechanism of the blockage, the veto vote, but it does not explain how that blockage was politically sustained. It does not explain how the United States representatives managed meeting after meeting across changes of administration and changes of ambassadors to justify their obstruction before an international audience that was increasingly opposed to it. So blocking a resolution is one thing, defending that blocking repeatedly in public before the eyes of the world, that is a different problem, and it is a problem solved in language. That discursive dimension of obstruction is what my work takes as its object. So here is my central claim stated as plainly as I can. The veto was not the sole tool that prolonged the Council's inaction. United States representatives deployed a coherent discursive architecture that legitimized their obstruction, and that legitimization work was not incidental. It was what lowered the political and moral costs of inaction to a level at which the inaction could actually be sustained. Now, think of it this way. A veto by itself is a blunt act. Casting it once might be defensible as pragmatic realism, but casting it 6 times while tens of thousands die and while a famine is confirmed, that creates an enormous legitimacy problem for the actor doing the vetoing. The discourse is how that legitimacy problem is managed. The discourse is what converts a refusal to halt mass killing into something that can be presented as a principed restraint, as patience or prudence or something like that. Now, I don't make this argument about everything the US representative said. I focus on 3 specific mechanisms because these 3 recur with striking regularity across the 6 vetoes, which tells us they are structured features of the discourse, not random verbal text. The first is euphemism, softening acts that would otherwise appear indefensible, like when turning killing into loss or turning engineered starvation into humanitarian needs. The second is lexical absence. This is simply not naming the reference whose naming would invite condemnation. So words like occupation, siege, collective punishment, genocide are simply avoided. And the third is agent deletion. This is when the speakers are grammatically obscuring who is responsible, removing the actor from the sentence so that harm appears to happen without anyone doing it. Now, each of these is a classical category in discourse analysis. What I show is that together they form a single coordinated operation. I'll take you through each one with examples from the transcripts, but first, let me lay out what I set out to do and the theoretical ground I'm standing on. The study has three objectives, and they organize the whole paper. First is to situate the United States vetoes within the broader pattern of council paralysis on Gaza. I want to place the vetoes in their institutional context, not as isolated votes, but as moments in a sequence shaped by mounting legal and political pressure. Second is the analytical core, which is to examine the three discursive strategies, euphemism, lexical absence, and agent deletion, as they operate across the relevant council meetings. And this is where most of the work lives. And third, which is the bigger payoff, is to assess what this case reveals about the relationship between discourse, legitimacy, and collective security in today's United Nations system. Because if my argument holds, it has implications well beyond this one conflict. It tells us something about how the principal security organ of the world can be talked into immobility. So let me now turn to the foundations, why critical discourse analysis is the right tool, what legal yardstick we measure the discourse against, and why I treat inaction itself as a form of power. The founding premise of CDA is simple but consequential. It states simply that language is never neutral. When a speaker chooses one word over another, or organizes a narrative one way rather than another, or builds a sentence in the active rather than the passive voice, those choices encode premises. Premises about who is acting, what caused what, and who bears moral responsibility. In political discourse on conflict, these choices can foreground or obscure culpability. They can construct in-groups and out-groups, and they can shape what counts as legitimate violence and what counts as acceptable inaction. I draw on four main strands of this tradition. The backbone is Norman Fairclough's three-dimensional model, where Fairclough asks the analyst to move across three levels: the text itself, the discursive praxis, and the social practice. Now, crucially, the analyst is asked to not just to describe the language, but to explain it in terms of those wider structures. That movement is the central analytical move of my paper. Then from Van Dyck, I take the treatment of ideology and manipulation, the idea that powerful actors shape public cognition through implicit meaning, through what is suggested rather than what is stated outright. This grounds my handling of euphemism and lexical absence as ideologically structured choices, not accidents of style. From Van Leeuwen, I take a fine-grade socio-semantic toolkit for analyzing how social actors are represented, and just as importantly, how they are removed from a representation, specifically through agent deletion. By the way, Van Dyck notes that such devices are especially abundant in bureaucratic procedural language, which is exactly the register of the Security Council. And from Reisegel and Woodak's discourse historical approach, I take attention to the argumentation and the rhetorical strategy, to how speakers construct their own group and their opponents in adversarial settings. Now, what unites these trends is a refusal to treat linguistic analysis as an end in itself. The words are a route to understanding power, and that's why throughout the analysis I read the US representatives' choices against the normative and legal structures of the international system in which they were speaking, which brings me to the second foundation. Now, you cannot say a word is conspicuously absent unless you can say what it is absent against. You cannot say a term is euphemism unless you can name the harsher, more accurate term it is standing in for. So we need a benchmark. And the benchmark I suggest is the body of international law that governs armed conflicts and the Council's duty to respond to it. Here I have three pillars. The first pillar is international humanitarian law, the Geneva and Hague Conventions and customary international humanitarian law. Its core principles are distinction, proportionality, precaution, and humanity, and it contains specific prohibition that matter enormously for this case. Like the targeting of civilians, collective punishment, the use of starvation as a method of warfare, and forcible transfer. The second pillar is the international criminal law. Here, the Rome Statute and the jurisprudence of the International Criminal Court, which translates those prohibitions into individual criminal responsibility for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And the Genocide Convention is especially live here because of South Africa's January 24 case against Israel at the International Court of Justice, which placed the question of genocide squarely on the table during during the very period I studied. The third pillar is the charter, the UN Charter itself. Article 24 gives the Council primary responsibility. Article 25 makes its decision binding. Article 39 through 42 gives it the power to determine a threat to the peace and to impose enforcement measures. And set against all of that is Article 27, which is the textual basis of the veto. So the Charter contains within itself a structural tension. It commands the Council to act, and it simultaneously equips a single permanent member to stop the action. Now, here's why this framework matters analytically. It tells us precisely what the discourse is working on. Euphemism softens the language that would otherwise invoke these legal categories. Lexical absence omits the reference that would activate them, and agent deletion removes the subjects to whom legal responsibility would attach. Now, without that benchmark, obstruction is just a political description. It's a matter of opinion. But with it, obstruction becomes legally consequential. It becomes the frustration of a council mandate under Article 24 in the face of conduct that implicates the Geneva Convention, the Geneva Conventions, the Genocide Convention, and customary law. There is one more conceptual move I need to make before we get to the analysis, and it is the move that justifies the whole approach. Now, we tend to think of doing nothing as the absence of a decision, a simple void, or a failure to choose. I want to challenge that intuition. I argue, following a long line of scholarship, that non-decision is itself a substantive exercise of power. The classical source is Bashrash and Baratz, writing in 1962. They identified what they called non-decision making as the second phase of power. This is the power to keep an issue off the agenda entirely or to suppress a demand before it is ever voiced. In the study of international organizations, Michael Lipson, drawing on Brunson, describes organized hypocrisy, the way institutions facing contradictory pressures decouple their condemnatory talk from their substantive action. They say the right things and do nothing. And that is almost a literal description of a council that verbally laments a humanitarian catastrophe while withholding any enforcement. And in discourse studies specifically, Thomas Hunkin's work on textual silence shows that what is left unsaid, such as the perpetrators not named, the legal categories not invoked, or the complicity not mentioned, is just as analyzable and just as consequential as what is explicitly stated. So here is the payoff, and it is the hinge of the whole work. If inaction is produced and sustained by language, then the linguistic practices that produce it become a proper object of analysis in their own right. Non-decision is not a procedural void that just happened. It is a consequential institutional choice. And that is exactly what makes critical discourse analysis the suitable instrument. Because remember, the CDA is built to link the small linguistic choices to the large institutional outcome. Now, with those three foundations in place, CDA as the apparatus, international law as a benchmark, and inaction as power, let me show you how I actually did the analysis. Now, the study is a qualitative longitudinal critical discourse analysis. It is qualitative because our question is not how often a word appears. A frequency count couldn't tell us how a particular phrasing functions to legitimate obstruction within the specified genre of diplomatic speech. So we need close reading, not just counting. And it is longitudinal, and this turns to be essential because we examine all 6 vetoes as a sequence, not as 6 separate snapshots. The reason is that the institutional pressure on the United States deepened steadily over those 23 months. So by tracking the discourse across the full sequence, we can see which features persist regardless of pressure and which features shift in response to specific events. That distinction turns out to be the single most revealing finding of the paper. Now, hold that thought, I'll come back to it. The corpus is the 6 explanations of vote and the surrounding interventions delivered by the United States representatives across these 6 meetings. They are from the Security Council verbatim record 9442 in October 23 on a Brazilian draft through the symbolic 10,000th meeting of the Council in September 25. All of these are publicly available verbatim records retrievable through the United Nations Digital Library. I also read them against the documents that frame them, such as the Secretary General's Article 99 letter, the International Court of Justice's Provisional Measures Order, though those framing documents are not themselves subjected to discourse analysis. The unit of analysis is the United States statements, the moment when, in the act of casting the veto, the United States has to account for that act before the Council and before the world. Now, the analysis has 2 movements. The first, which I'll spend most of our remaining time on, reconstructs the architecture of legitimation, and the second traces its trajectory over time. Let me first add a word about method, because it protects everything that follows. Diplomatic language is conventionally impersonal, hedged, and full of abstract nouns. Not every passive sentence is ideological. Therefore, I do not rest my argument on the mere presence of soft language. Instead, I rest it on asymmetry and markedness. For example, where the same speaker in the same statement uses vivid, fully agentive language for one actor and euphemism and agent deletion for another. That asymmetry cannot be convention because convention would apply evenly. And also where a term is missing from the US text but present in the draft resolution, in the Secretary General's briefings, in the Biden instruments the draft itself recalls, and even in the statements of the United States' own closest ally, that absence is marked, so it is conspicuous. That contrastive evidence is what carries the argument. So three mechanisms recur across 6 vetoes. Let me take them one at a time. The first mechanism is euphemism, and it creates, and the clearest single instance opens the whole sentence on the 18th of October 23. The meeting was dominated by the strike on Al Ahli Arab Hospital the previous evening, and the US representatives referred to, and I quote, yesterday's explosion at Al Ahli Arab Hospital. Now, here is why the word explosion is marked. Every other delegation that addressed the same event named it as an act. Russia called it a missile attack, China an airstrike, Malta horrific strikes, etc. So those nouns name an act without necessarily attributing blame, but explosion does something different. It dissolves the act itself. An explosion is an occurrence. It has no projectile and no author. Notice the careful point I make here. A cautious speaker who wanted just to avoid attribution could simply have said strike, which was equally non-attributive. So what explosion removes is not the attribution, it is the act itself. Then there is the rendering of mass death as misfortune. I quote, "We mourn this tragic loss of life." That phrasing recurs continuously in every verbatim across 3 different ambassadors. And by the way, that consistency is itself meaningful. It signals an institutional register, not one person's habit. Think about what the words do. Loss frames the dead as misled rather than killed. Tragedy reframes, or tragic reframes a produced outcome, something someone did, as a befallen or something that simply happened, like flood or an earthquake. But the most telling pattern is on the right. Watch how the language of starvation over time shifts over time. In October 23, we quote the humanitarian crisis facing Palestinians. This is as if the crisis faces people the way weather might. In November 24, Palestinians now wonder where they will find their next meal. And this is domestic uncertainty standing in for the worst famine that food security system had ever recorded. In June 25, no one wants to see Palestinians or Palestinian civilians go hungry or thirsty. This is the language of a missed meal in the very session the United Nations called Gaza, the hungriest place on earth. And by September 25, the bland Gaza has humanitarian needs. Now, here's the central point. The euphemism grows softer precisely as the factual basis of the harsher term grows stronger. In other words, euphemism grows softer as the famine determination moves from projected to confirmed. Now, if you are simply describing reality, your language would get harsher as the facts got worse. not the opposite. So the fact that it gets softer is the signature of legitimation work, not neutral description. The second mechanism is lexical absence, and as I said, absence is only meaningful against an expectation. So I measure it against the words actually circulating in the room. There is a stable set of terms that is absent across every single veto, like occupation, siege or blockade, collective banishment, starvation, and forced displacements. These were supplied repeatedly by all other speakers, and they appear in the draft resolutions. However, they are simply absent from the United States text. But true absences don't just stay stable, they escalate and they track the rising legal stakes. The most dramatic is the word genocide, and its handling hardens in three distinct stages. In the early and middle vetoes, at stage one, the word is simply unspoken, so there is a kind of omission. By June 25, which I consider is stage two, the US moves from silence to repudiation. So it dismisses what it calls spurious accusations of genocide as inaccurate, as dangerous. The word is now spoken, but only to be denied. And by September 25, which is stage three, it moves again from repudiating the accusation to dismantling the instrument that grounds it. So the Commission of Inquiry report, which had formally found genocide, is called Slender's Lies, Lies and Distortions, an anti-Semitic witch hunt that should be eliminated, according to the US representatives, of course. So the handling of the term genocide moves from omission to repudiation of the naming, then to the destruction of the evidence. And it hardens precisely as the external pressure to use the word becomes impossible to ignore. And there's one more finding here, which I think is the most robust in the paper. The charter is not absent, it is selectively present. Every time the United States invokes the charter, it invokes Article 51, Israel's inherent right to self-defense. The one provision that licenses the use of force. But all the articles that would obligate the Council to act are absent throughout, even though other delegations cite them constantly. So the charter is mobilized exactly where it authorizes force or counsels restraint, and suppressed exactly where it would compel Do you hear me? Professor, do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Yes, we can hear you now.
I had a trouble. I don't know what happened.
It's okay, no problem. You may continue with your presentation.
Okay. Is this Asian deletion? Do you see Asian deletion?
I think you were in the previous. I think you were working on the previous one because we're seeing.
This one?
Yes, yeah, that one.
Okay. Then I'll restart this section because I don't know what happened. This was probably an issue of internet. So I was saying that the third mechanism is Asian deletion, and which is the grammatical removal of the responsible actor through agentless passives. And here the asymmetry I mentioned earlier becomes vivid. The discourse does not delete agency in general, rather it deletes agency asymmetrically. It removes it for one actor while maximizing it for another. And you can see both halves operating within single statements. On one side, harm to Palestinians is constantly rendered without an agent. The hospital strike is an agentless explosion. The dead are the subjects of intransitive loss. Every innocent Palestinian life loss, homes have been destroyed. Again, passive with no agent. Aid is being flowing into Gaza, an intransitive verb that, again, quietly deletes the party actually controlling the crossing. And the single most striking finding across all of these statements is that Israel never once appears as the grammatical agent of a harmful act. It appears only as a right holder. Israel has the right to defend itself. As a partner, we work with the governments of Israel, or even sometimes as a victim. On the other side, agency attaching to Hamas is grammatically maximal or even total. From the very start, Hamas's own actions have brought on this severe humanitarian crisis. Then it is Hamas standing in the way of a ceasefire. Then by the last veto, in its most concentrated, Hamas started this brutal conflict, perpetrated the worst massacre, has starved the hostages, and is responsible for starting and continuing this war. Now, look at the third one. Hamas has starved the hostages. The international humanitarian law category of starvation is this time foreclosed not by silence, but by being spent elsewhere, relocated onto an inverted referent. So agent deletion is systematical in both directions. In one side, the proximate cause is emptied of any actor, and in the other side, a single distal actor, Hamas, is installed. Now, I have presented these three mechanisms separately for clarity, but the heart of our argument is that they are not three separate habits. They are one coordinated operation, and I can show you that in a single clause. Gaza has humanitarian needs because of Hamas. Now, in these 7 words, you watch all three mechanisms fire at once. Euphemism downgrades a siege and sustained military operation to the bland noun needs. Agent deletion empties that condition of any proximate Israeli actor. And reattribution installs a single distal agent, which is Hamas, in the vacated causal position. Meanwhile, lexical absence is doing the quite enabling work in the background, because occupation, siege, starvation, and genocide are never uttered in the operative frame. So there is simply no vocabulary on the table through which this conduct could be named as a breach, the kind of breach that would trigger a duty to act. So here you can see how amazing is language. A single short clause dissolves the determination, the duty, and the perpetrator altogether. And the product of the three mechanisms working in a concrete has four features: an agentless catastrophe, things happen but no one does them; a single already named culpable party, which is Hamas; a body of binding law and an array of fact-finding instruments that go either unspoken or stripped of authority; and a council whose only proper posture is to wait. And here is the punchline: that posture, waiting, not hindering, letting diplomacy pay out, is precisely the posture that a veto enacts. So the discourse and the veto are not two separate causes of the inaction. The discourse furnishes the justification that makes the veto legible as prudence rather than obstruction. The non-action is, in its fullest sense, produced, legitimized, and maintained in language. Now, the second movement adds the dimension of time, and this is where the longitudinal design pays off. The claim is that the underlying architecture stays constant across all six vetoes, but its surface forms harden in direct proportion to the strength of the evidence they are deployed to neutralize. Let me trace that through the table, focusing on how the call of a ceasefire is managed at each stage. Now, in veto 1, October 23, the strategy is suppression. The word ceasefire is withheld entirely, even though the whole meeting revolves around it. The hospital strikes is named only as an explosion. In veto 2, under the pressure of the Secretary General's Article 99 invocation, simple suppression cannot hold, so the strategy shifts to inversion. The word is now named, but recoded as the danger and unsustainable ceasefire that would plant the seeds of the next war. In veto 3, in February 24, now there is more pressure. The International Court of Justice has issued its provisional measures order, and genocide is explicitly on the table. The strategy mitigates to deferral. A ceasefire is conceded as a legitimate goal, but indefinitely postponed. So you can find expressions like now it is not the time, as soon as practicable, and tellingly the International Court of Justice order and the word genocide are met with total silence. In veto 4, November 24, again more pressure. The United Kingdom crosses from abstention to a yes vote, leaving the US isolated 14-1. And the draft now names famine. The strategy mitigates again to conditionalization. A ceasefire is acceptable only if linked to hostage release. So that's refusing an unconditional ceasefire can be relocated as fidelity to hostages. Vetoes 5 and 6, which is the final phase, and notice the color, the change color in the slide. Here, the pressure is no longer only legal, but it is evidentiary. So in June 25, the strategy turns on the act of demanding itself. The resolution is recast as performative theater, so that blocking it can be presented as defending the council's seriousness, that is, delegitimation of the demand. And by September 25, the strategy reaches its most aggressive form, the delegitimation of the instruments. The Food Security Report is dismissed as having flawed methodology, and the Commission of Inquiry report is called slanderous and witch hunt. So here is the decisive logical point. A fixed convention would not migrate in order to defend a constant result. Conventions don't adapt under pressure. Only legitimation work behaves this way. A work that is oriented to preserving a particular outcome against a shifting environment, where each shift is occasioned by a specific increment of pressure. Hence, the surface keeps changing, the architecture and the outcome stay fixed. That is my diachronic proof that blockage is discursively manufactured and self-sustaining, not merely a byproduct of one vote. The next slide condenses the lexical absence findings into a single picture. And I want to spend just a moment on it because it makes the trajectory visible at a glance. Now, down the left are the terms we would expect, like occupation, siege, collective punishment, and so on. Across the top are the 6 vetoes, and each cell is coded. The pale gray cells marked with a dash are silent omission. The term simply isn't there. So you can see that most of the international humanitarian law vocabulary is gray with a dash. So there is a stable or total absence of all the expected terms. But now follow the 2 rows that change color. Look at the famine row and the genocide row. They begin gray, omission. Then at veto 5, they shift famine to the gold euphemism only marking, and genocide to the R for repudiated. And by veto 6, both go to the dark D, which is delegitimized, where the evidentiary instrument itself is attacked. And notice the blue row at the bottom, Article 51 self-defense, which is present almost throughout. So the charter appears, it just appears selectively. So that one strip of color, gray to gold to red, is the central diachronic finding of the paper, rendered visually. The mechanism had to evolve from keeping the words out of the room to taking the words down, because by the 6th veto, everyone else in the room was saying them. You will notice some cells are marked NA rather than scored. That's deliberate, and it matters methodologically. NA stands for not applicable. It marks the cells where I can't find score. I can't fairly score absence because the expectation wasn't yet at play at that date. For example, the International Court of Justice row is NA for the first 2 vetoes because the court's order in South Africa versus Israel didn't exist until January 24. So you can't accuse a 23 statement for being silent on a 24 ruling. Let me pull the 2 movements together. The veto is the procedural instrument of non-action, but the discourse is what renders that non-action legitimate, what converts a refusal to stop masculine into prudence, into realism, into patience, into fidelity to hostages, and finally into a defense of the council's own seriousness. Euphemism, lexical absence, and Asian deletion are the means of that conversion. They are not rhetorical ornaments or decoration around a decision taken on the grounds. They are constitutive of the decision's legitimacy and therefore part of the mechanism of obstruction itself. And this is why the longitudinal design matters so much. A single vote looked at in isolation could plausibly be dismissed as ordinary diplomatic hedging. It is the recurrence of the same architecture across all 6 vetoes, across 3 representatives, and above all, its adaptation to each new increment of pressure that lets us distinguish structural legitimation from incidental style. Now, let me close. What this case ultimately illustrates is a mechanism by which institutional failure is made to appear structurally unavoidable. We are used to studying how language is mobilized to justify intervention, to take a state into using force, to study action. Okay, this work is the mirror image. Here, language was deployed to legitimize deadlock, to render a council that was mandated to act and structurally enabled to act into one whose inaction could be presented as the only responsible course. And at the very end of the sequence, when the instruments that establish atrocity are themselves recast as the problem, the discourse arrives at the remarkable destination, a position in which there is, as it were, nothing left to act upon. No famine because the report is flawed, no genocide because the finding is slanderous, and if there is no breach, then no duty is breached by declining the act. So what I contribute? For international relations scholarship, I show that linguistic practice inside the principal security organ does not merely reflect a distribution of power. It actively constitutes the conditions under which enforcement and protection become less imaginable. The durability of the veto is in part discursive, is in part a discursive accomplishment. And for discourse studies, I show that the classical CDA categories, euphemism, lexical absence, and Asian deletion, retain their full analytical force in the most formalized diplomatic genre there is, operating not on public opinion at large, but on the narrow expert adversarial audience of the council itself, and producing consequences that are juridical and humanitarian, not merely rhetorical. And so the practical implication is straightforward. Even if it is not easy, restoring the vocabulary of responsibility, the vocabulary of determination and of breach, the vocabulary that the Charter and the international humanitarian law actually provide, is not a peripheral or merely academic concern. It is a precondition for the Council's capacity to discharge the very mandate that is exercised in its name. Thank you for your invaluable time. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, and I'd be glad to take questions and observations you might have.
Thank you, dear Professor. Thank you all, and I hope you are all doing great. So in this topic, you showed and depict how language can be used by powerful states to advance and legitimize their political interest in the international institution and organization. So the presentation started by introducing the problem of the ongoing Gaza crisis and explain why the discourse of the US representative at the United Nations Security Council deserves critical examination. It then presents the central argument that institutional non-decision is not simply a political outcome, but also constructed and legitimized through discourse. This was followed by the study objectives, which focused on identifying the discursive mechanism used to justify US vetoes and examining how these mechanisms shape the representation of violence and responsibility. So, for the theoretical framework draws on Fairclough critical discourse analysis, then Van Dyck approach to ideology and power, and Van Leeuwen framework for the representation of social actors. For the methodological section, it explains that the study employed a qualitative critical discourse analysis of 6 US veto statements delivered at the United Nations Security Council between October 2023 and September 2025. For the data analysis was like presented in 2 movements. The first examines the architectures of the discourse by identifying the 3 recurring discursive mechanisms, which are euphemism, lexical absence, and agent deletion. The second one traced the trajectory of these mechanisms across the 6 veto statements, showing that while the overall discursive structure remained consistent, these strategies became increasingly pronounced as political and legal pressure intensified. So for the discussion, I highlighted that the broader implication of these findings, while the conclusion emphasized that institutional inaction can be produced and legitimized through discourse. Overall, the presentation makes a valuable contribution to critical discourse analysis by demonstrating how language can normalize and sustain institutional dialogue in international politics. So for the questions, let's check the chat box. I have a question here by Mohammed. He said that does using of euphemism, agent deletion, and other mechanisms emanate from a sense of guilt and willingness to cover up, or from a backing up of perpetrator of the genocidal campaign? So this is the first question by Mohammed.
Would you please repeat the question?
It said that does using euphemism and agent deletion and other mechanism emanate from a sense of guilt and a willingness to cover up, or from a backing up of perpetrator of the genocidal campaign?
Well, this is a right question to press, and I think the design is organized to resist it, because at the very beginning I stated that these strategies were the most strategies employed in the United States discourse, or in the United States representatives discourse. Of course, they don't rely specifically on these 3. There are others. There are other strategies, but I think since my work is an article, so it couldn't, the scope couldn't collect all of the linguistic strategies altogether. So maybe for another more extended work, I think effectively to add on other strategies.
Thank you, dear professor. Another question again by Mohammed. He said, what is the utility of the CDA in a world where the superpowers are the perpetrators and the judges at the same time? What is like the purpose behind using discourse, critical discourse analysis in a world like dominated by power, superpowers?
Yes, that's an interesting question, because if superpowers are dominating, so we can't deal with them. But at least when we expose this kind of topics, we make people aware of how language is used. You know, people are used to find this kind of work in works that treats the media in general. For example, how the media frame certain conflicts, etc. But my goal is to expose that the language is not used only to affect a layman. It is used in its most specific genre of diplomatic speech. I mean, in the United Nations the Security Council, you have experts, you have ambassadors, you have superpower representatives, and the language is used there also to affect how they see the world and how they react to it.
Yes, thank you. Another question by Professor Ahmed bin Isa. He said, how did you identify and code instances of Asian deletion, and what challenges did you encounter in distinguishing between strategic omission and mere linguistic convention?
Well, as I precised, that's an interesting question, by the way. What the work was focusing on, or the design of the work, is qualitative. So the number of expressions was not that important for me. What was important is how to analyze these fragments of text, if you want. And for the challenges, I think the most challenge I found is to separate between the human side of me and the academic side. Because when you see, for example, in the news, or when you look at images coming from Gaza, the situation is really catastrophic and it is worth talking about. However, as an academician, I had to stay objective and to do the study objectively, so that there is no bias in argumenting for the non-action of the United Nations Security Council.
Yes, thank you. So as we don't have any question in the chat board, so I have another question for you, dear professor, concerning the methodology. In critical discourse analysis, for example, when it is more like appropriate or suitable to use qualitative approach, and when can we use like quantitative approach, or like the mixed? Like, are there some studies which to use qualitative and others quantitative, or?
That's a fair point. Sometimes corpus linguistic dimension would be a natural and welcomed complement, because frequency alone can't answer my question, but it can certainly reinforce it. So I think that a quantitative apparatus in parallel with a qualitative one would make the study much more interesting, if you want. And I don't see quantification as a rival to what I have done. I see it as the next stage of the project itself.
Yes, thank you. Another question: does omissions in discourse amount to tampering with crime scene and twisting facts? This is a question by Mohammed.
Sorry, does omission
in discourse amount to tampering with a crime scene and twisting facts?
I think omission here in my work is based on the text, on exactly on what US representatives have said during the meetings of the United Nations Security Council. So omission here, what I mean by omission, I mean when the United States representatives have to account for their vetoes, they were avoiding to use certain terms. And this avoidance is the omission, I mean, in my work.
Yes. Another question for me is like, do you think this discursive strategy identified in your study are specific to the US discourse on Gaza, or could they also be found in discourse of other major powers, like in different conflicts, like Russia discourse on Ukraine and or China discourse on Taiwan and other conflicts?
I see your point. Anyway, that's the hypothesis. The method is built to test, not a result I have established. The natural applications are maybe other sustained obstructions where a powerful actor must justify not acting, such as Russia on Ukraine or China, even other topics such as Myanmar or Sudan, which are topics sometimes not mentioned even in the United Nations Security Council. So I think it will be interesting to extend this work towards other conflicts like these.
Questions.
Professor?
Thank you so much.
I hope you got my answer.
Professor Angelica.
Yes, I was waiting for Professor to answer or to make his comment, but okay, I have a question here that I have written, but I'm going to read it aloud. It says, departing from the concepts of power and sugar-coated non-decision making, do you consider, Professor, that this is also a hegemonic discourse that seeks to re-victimize the people of Gaza?
Yes, this was the challenge, as I have said in a previous question. The challenge is to keep myself outside the conflict as a human, and to be as objective as I can. So this is not about re-victimizing people of Gaza. My work deals specifically with the words utilized in the meetings and in the records of the United Nations. So I'm just analyzing these words in a critical discourse manner.
So given this circumstance that you just explained and reinforced, do you think this work of yours, this research of yours, could be replicated in different contexts? Because as we know, there are other conflicts, like in African countries, like in Latin American countries, like in my country, in Colombia. There are many genocidal, let's say, campaigns that have been carried out throughout the years. So do you think, or do you consider your interesting contribution could be replicated in other contexts?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it would be interesting to expose, redo or not redo, to try it in other conflicts, as I mentioned earlier, such as the conflict in Russia with Ukraine, specifically with in conflicts with hegemonic powers. You know, for example, China in Myanmar. This is a topic no one mentioned at all. The conflicts in Sudan also. There are many conflicts around the world that we could apply this hypothesis on and test how the language affects the outcome of these conflicts through the decisions taken or non-taken in the United Security Council.
Okay, there is one more comment here from one of the users. He says, or she says, the choice of certain linguistic terms instead of others is done on purpose. It's ideological and political. Do you agree with this comment?
it's not ideological, non-political. The strategies are multiple in language, and the choice was limited by the scope of the study. So this is an article as I have said, it's not a dissertation or something bigger where I can include all the strategic linguistic tools. So I had just to focus on what I have in front of me, which is the record of the meeting, and to select the most recurred strategies that I find in the text. And by the way, you can go to the library of the United Nations and download the documents, and you can check if there is other strategies that you can work on. It would be great.
That's fantastic. We remind our viewers to register on the attendance confirmation link that has been provided in the chat. Do you have any further comments? Maybe? Okay, so Professor, I thank you for your presentation. And if you have any final invitation or call to action to make, please, the floor is yours.
Well, in closing, I deeply appreciate your engagement with this topic. My warm thanks to Beit Lisaniyat for hosting this event, and a special thanks to Professor Ahmed Ben Isa for the invitation. Thank you, Dr. Angelica, for guiding this conversation in such a professional manner. And thanks to Professor Ahmed Martou for the insightful and stimulating discussion. It's a real privilege of presenting to this esteemed group. And I hope this will not be my last visit to Beit Lisaniyat. And I look forward to returning in near future, inshallah. Thank you so much.
Inshallah, we also look forward to having you again. It was also for me a pleasure, an honor, as always, to make part of this interesting, insightful conversations. Thank you to Professor Ahmed Martou for his insightful comments and for reading out the questions from the public. Thank you very much.
Thank you.